Welcome to MarsCast, the official podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where faculty and friends explore the depths of faith, unpack biblical truth, and engage with the critical issues of our time. I'm Jared Luchabor, Director of Marketing. Thank you for tuning in. Well, we're back from our brief hiatus in the month of July to jump right back into our continuing series on church history, specifically the Reformation. Back with me today is Dr. Alan Strange. He serves as both president of Mid-America Reformed Seminary and professor of church history, and you really bring a wealth of insight as we begin this two-part look at John Calvin. Thank you for joining me once again.
Good to be here with you, and it's always a joy to talk about all these people, and who among our types doesn't want to talk about John Calvin?
Totally. So we're going to look at John Calvin. We're going to look at his early life, his conversion, and the writing of his most famous work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Dr. Strange, tell us about Calvin's background. What was his upbringing like, and what led him to the Reformation?
Well, I'm sure that all of our listeners are probably very keen on his birth because they were all celebrating in the month of July. He was born on July 10th. So I know that all of our listeners were I could hear the champagne corks popping. Thank you.
You're welcome.
He was born on that date in 1509. Many of you remember 2009, which was the 500th anniversary of his birth, and a lot of us went around. Though I'm not an expert in Calvin, my expertise is really in later 18th and 19th century Presbyterian matters, especially. I love Calvin very much, and back in 2009, I had 6 different conferences that I spoke on in that year about Calvin.
Interesting.
And I remember calling my wife when it was over. It was up in Canada. Ponoka was my last conference. And she said, "How'd it go?" And I said, "It went well, and I've really enjoyed it, but I'm ready to move on to something else," because I've talked a lot about Calvin, but he's great to talk about. He was born in the Picardy region of France in Noyon. And also, by the time this comes out, our dear colleague of many years, Professor Emeritus Mark Vanderhart, is going to be in France very soon from when this is being recorded, and is going to Noyon, and will be visiting there. So that's exciting. Calvin was educated in humanist circles, pursuing a theological career at the behest of his father. Now, when I say humanist, I don't mean secular humanism that people talk about. I mean the humanism that comes out of the Renaissance. That is to say, a focus on the humanities, the arts, that return, the watchword of the Renaissance was ad fontes, to the sources. Mm-hmm. So to the sources meant originally, for those in the Renaissance, back to the Greek and Latin sources. But it was taken over, as it were, by the church, which said, yes, the Reformed churches, the Reformed and Lutheran churches, let's go back to the sources, which meant the Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament. So Calvin was reared in those circles and was pursuing a theological career at the behest of his father. His father was a notary in the bishop's secretarial service, and he had great ecclesiastical plans for his son Calvin, Jean Calvin, and managed to secure some benefices for Calvin at a young age. That was one of the problems in the churches. You could get these benefices, which would be a holding, a parish where you would get some money. You would hire a rector to do it for you, or a vicar, I should say, to do it for you, but you would get paid some money for something you're not doing. The English would refer to them as sinecures, meaning without worry. I remember my wife once was reading and she came across sinecure, and I said, well, it's a position that you get paid for, but you have no responsibility. And she said, how do you get one of these? But at any rate, between 1523 and 2708, he took an arts degree in Paris, among other colleges, attending the Collège de Montaigu, which Erasmus went to, Loyola and others studied there. But a little wrinkle here. His father and the bishop came under some disagreement. They got into disagreement, and his father was excommunicated from the church in 1528. Huh. And by the way, you might say, well, what heresy? Well, excommunication Particularly, this was one of the great abuses in the church, especially in the Middle and late Middle Ages. It was often used politically. In other words, you get into a dispute with a cleric, a higher cleric, or whatever the case may be, like the Pope and a king. The king may not actually be teaching heresy, right? But the Pope puts him out of the church because he's disagreeing with the Pope.
Yeah.
The Pope uses that as a tool, which is not correct and not a right use of discipline. So he gains his master in Paris, and he goes because his father is excommunicated. He decides that his son should pursue a law career. I'm out of the church now, so go for law. So we're back to Lutheran pursuing law, right? And he goes through the career. He goes to Orléans to study law. And in fact, one of his chief professors at Orléans, who was considered one of the great law professors in France, when he heard that Calvin was going in a theological direction, sort of becoming a theologian and so forth, he said, France has lost its greatest lawyer. So Calvin had quite the legal mind and was regarded highly. So, I mean, he actually did go through the training, but he returns to Paris after the death of his father. So his father dies in 1531, so he doesn't feel bound to pursue the law in the same way. And so what he does is he takes up a kind of career. The career as a humanist scholar, and that's what he wants to do. It appears. I mean, he was an excellent Latinist, and his first published work was a commentary on the Stoic Seneca's De Clementia, and on divine mercies. The divine's not in there, but that's what it means. He had hoped that this work, which he carefully worked on, would get him somewhere as a scholar, but it didn't really receive much acclaim. So I think it seems like the Lord frustrated his efforts in that way. And some say that this is perhaps what turned him more towards Nicolas Cop, who was there in the university in Paris, and other Protestant friends. So that's sort of what he's doing. Let me just say this in terms of his career overall. What do we make of him? You mentioned the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Will Durant said it's one of the 10 books that shook the world. And at the same time, he calls Calvin's theology, he says it's the most blasphemous and monstrous notion brought forth in the long history of nonsense. Maybe I'll just raise this question. I often get asked this in conferences, and I got asked this a lot back in 2009. And so you try to get a short answer to it. What is it that so bugs people about Calvinism? Why, of all the sorts of things, you can think of different points of view or different theological systems. Why do people so hate Calvinism? Well, we could say on the front end, yes, sometimes it's Calvinist. Sometimes we can be jerks.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's really the heart of the matter. I think Calvinism is offensive to sinful, unbelieving flesh because more than any, it exalts God and abases man. It puts God in his proper place, and it puts man in his proper place. And you might say, well, it's election, and all of that comes into it because God is God. In a Calvinistic understanding, God is God, unapologetically so. And man is the creature, and he's finite. He's not God. Secondly, he's not just finite, he's sinful. So that puts him in an even more precarious place. And he's not even able to express the praise that God deserves for saving such a one. And so I think that I do think Calvinism, like no other system, does give God the glory and put man in his place.
Right, absolutely.
So that's a little bit. We could say a lot more about all that.
Well, Calvin, didn't have the same dramatic spiritual crisis that Luther had, but his conversion was still pivotal. What do we know about it?
Well, not a great deal. He did write later in his commentary on the Psalms that he was probably late in 1533 or early 1534. There's some debate about when this happened, but that the Lord suddenly converted him, he said, and subduing his heart and bringing him into obedience to him. And it's after that he began to champion the Protestant cause. So no, he did not have he wasn't in the monastery, he wasn't in a theological kind of profession like Luther was in. As I mentioned, he was a humanist and was pursuing that track. But it was sort of like the Lord grabbed a hold of him, if you will, and subdued him, made him to walk with him. And by March 1536, Calvin has amazingly produced the first edition of the Institutes, which was expanded over the years through the final 1559 edition.
Well, let's talk about the Institutes. What made his work on that so unique and valuable to the cause of the Reformation?
Well, here's Calvin, 27 years old.
27 years old?
Yes.
Wow.
And the first edition of the Institutes is 1536. And so I don't want to discourage any of our listeners who might be trying, well, what was I doing at 27? I mean, we all know, you have Mozart, he's a little kid writing symphonies and so forth and so on. But here's Calvin, a very, very able man, and has well prepared himself as a humanist, as a legal scholar in all of these ways, and now converted probably, like I say, late 1533, 1534, somewhere in there. March 1536, he has produced this first edition. It was immediately recognized as a work of great theological genius and widely hailed as the major apologia of the Reformation. It's addressed to Francis I, the King of France, recognizing the truths brought forth in the Protestant Reformation and seeking to reject the lies of the opponents of the Reformation. So it's a kind of apology, really, is what it is. He's saying, this is this thing, this is the Protestant religion, this is this faith. Let me explain it. Most of the major themes of his theology are set forth in a mature style, though it's going to get, if any of our listeners have looked at the 1536 version, it's a rather slimmer version that will then be beefed up over the years. He followed initially the overall outline of Luther's small catechism. Self-consciously, he dealt in 4 chapters with the main topics of the catechism: the law, the gospel, using the Apostles' Creed, then the Lord's Prayer, the sacraments. 2 apologetic chapters were appended on the 5 false sacraments of the Roman Church and on Christian freedom, ecclesiastical power, and civil government. And many of our listeners know this will ultimately turn into the 4 books where he really deals with God and man, and then the second book, Christ, and the third, the Holy Spirit, and the fourth, all these matters of ecclesiastical and civil concern. Just to say this, Jared, very brief treatment is given to predestination. The doctrine is clearly important to him, but he's often portrayed as having this in the center of every discussion, and that this is kind of the organizing principle. But he defends the doctrine from those who would attack it, right? But he doesn't have a single question on it in his 1545 catechism. So the notion that Calvin is obsessed or consumed in some unhealthy way with this is just not true. So you have this affair in 1534, the Placard Affair, that resulted in the persecution of French Protestants, leading to Calvin's fleeing France. These placards were things that the Protestants put up attacking or arguing against several Roman Catholic things, particularly the Eucharist. And these were placed all over the place. And somebody very unwisely placed one of these placards on the bedroom door of the king, which, of course, he took to be a personal attack.
Right.
Very unwise move. And that leads to the Placard Affair leads to this persecution. And so he has to basically leave France. This is what gets Calvin out of France. And he's going to Strasbourg. That's where he wants to go and study with Martin Bucer. But doing so, going there, he stops over in Geneva. And he meets there one Guillaume Farel, who is a reformer in Geneva. And Farel, hearing of the presence of Calvin there, Calvin is already regarded, because he's got the Institutes, just been published, as this great defender of the Reformation, met with him and told him that he must join him in the attempt to reform Geneva, or God would curse him. And so we have one of our paintings here, or it's a lithograph of Farel confronting Calvin and more or less threatening him. The city of Geneva had embraced many of the elements of reform, but Farel there wanted Calvin to join him, and Calvin reluctantly agreed to stay. He introduced a confession. He sought to reform elements of the church order, particularly church discipline. The city council agreed to the first, but resisted on the second, on the church discipline question, because the city council wanted to keep the power of excommunication in the hands of the magistrate and not permit the church to exercise this authority. So by 1538, so Calvin is there in late 1536, then by 1538, his opponents had won office in the civil realm, and he and Farel were forced to leave the city, particularly after they had refused to administer the Lord's Supper, when the council refused to excommunicate certain persons. The council wouldn't excommunicate some people, probably, from what we know, guilty of adultery of some sort. Calvin and Farel said they should not take, and because the council said they can, they said, well, we won't have the supper. And they basically said, you're out of here.
Next week, Dr. Strange brings the story of John Calvin to a close by examining his return to Geneva, his further work in Strasbourg, and his enduring theological influence in the Reformed tradition. Until then, thank you for joining us on Marscast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or a colleague who might find it helpful or interesting. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if you have a moment, leave a rating or review. I'm Jared Luchibor. This has been another episode of Marscast. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time.